Judge Nathaniel Collins sat in his high-backed chair, staring down at the courtroom below. His cold gaze landed on Jamal Richardson, a 17-year-old black teenager standing nervously at the defendant's table. Jamal's hands shook slightly, his fingers fidgeting as he avoided eye contact with the stern-faced judge. Collins had seen hundreds of cases just like this one, or so he thought. A black boy accused of a crime. This time, it was the theft of expensive electronics from a local store. To Judge Collins, it seemed all too predictable. He prided himself on being a man of law and order, someone who delivered justice swiftly and without hesitation. He believed himself to be fair, impartial, and above all, experienced. Years of presiding over cases had sharpened his instincts, or at least, that's what he told himself. But what he didn't realize, or perhaps refused to see, was the prejudice that had silently crept into his judgments over the years. Unconscious biases clouded his decisions, especially when it came to cases involving young black men. He believed he was only doing his job, but each snap decision was influenced by deep-rooted assumptions he never questioned. Jamal stood quietly as the prosecutor laid out the case against him. The store owner claimed that Jamal had been seen near the electronics section just before several high-priced items went missing. There were no fingerprints, no video footage, but the store owner's words seemed enough to paint the picture Judge Collins was already forming in his mind. Collins had seen this play out before, a troubled teen, likely with a difficult home life, turning to theft for quick money. The details didn't need to be perfectly clear for the judge. The pattern was already familiar to him. Jamal's lawyer, a young and somewhat inexperienced public defender, argued that the case lacked evidence. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the store owner's testimony, the lack of any physical proof tying Jamal to the crime. But to Judge Collins, the lawyer's words barely registered. He looked at Jamal, his clothes slightly worn, his posture nervous, and saw a kid who fit the profile of so many other young men he'd sentenced over the years. In his mind, this case was just another example of a bad decision by a young man who should know better. Jamal's mother sat silently in the courtroom, her eyes filled with quiet desperation. She knew her son's innocence, but she also knew the weight of the system working against him. As the judge listened to the closing arguments, her gaze never wavered from Jamal, silently praying for a miracle, hoping someone would see what she saw, a good boy caught in a bad situation. The courtroom was silent as Judge Collins prepared to deliver his verdict. Without hesitation, he declared Jamal guilty and sentenced him to 6 months in a juvenile detention center. Jamal's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening in protest, but his words never came out. His mother gasped quietly, her face crumbling in despair. The judge didn't look at her. He simply gave a curt nod to the bailiff, signaling the end of another case. But what Judge Collins didn't know was that the evidence he ignored would soon come back to haunt him. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, echoing through the silent courtroom. Judge Nathaniel Collins didn't look up as the verdict was read. Guilty, he declared, his voice cold and final. The words hung heavy in the air, weighing down on everyone except for the judge himself. Seated in his chair, he barely acknowledged the gasps of disbelief from the small crowd in the gallery. His gaze briefly flickered over to Jamal Richardson, the young black teenager standing frozen at the defendant's table, wide-eyed and speechless. But Collins didn't waver. He had made up his mind. In his years on the bench, Collins had handled countless cases, many just like this one. Young black men accused of petty crimes, always the same story. In his mind, Jamal was no different. The store owner's testimony had been shaky, the evidence almost non-existent, but to Judge Collins, it didn't matter. He trusted his gut, and his gut told him that Jamal was guilty. There had been no need to dig deeper, no need to question whether the young man before him was innocent. The case had been open and shut, or so he believed. But as Jamal was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, something nagged at Collins. A brief flicker of doubt that he quickly pushed aside. He couldn't afford to doubt himself. He was a man of the law, a dispenser of justice. He couldn't be wrong. Or could he? In the back of the courtroom, Jamal's mother sat slumped in her seat, tears running silently down her face. She didn't plead or shout. She simply looked at the judge with an expression that held a lifetime's worth of sorrow and disappointment. It was a look Collins had seen before, but today it lingered with him. He didn't know why. The courtroom emptied, but the unease didn't leave him. As Collins walked back to his chambers, he found himself replaying the details of the case in his mind. Little things he had brushed aside earlier now seemed more significant. The store owner's inconsistent testimony, the lack of concrete evidence. Why hadn't he questioned it more? Why had he been so quick to believe Jamal was guilty? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. It was done. Jamal had been found guilty, and that was the end of it. But deep down, something told him this wasn't over. The case, which had seemed so simple at first, now felt like it was teetering on the edge of unraveling. Days later, Collins received a file marked urgent on his desk. Inside, there was a piece of evidence that had been overlooked during the trial, a security camera footage from the store where Jamal had allegedly committed the theft. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder, and for the first time in years, Judge Collins felt a pang of fear. What if he had made a mistake? The footage sat there waiting to be reviewed, a silent testament to the truth he had missed. Judge Nathaniel Collins had always seen himself as a man of principle. His father had been a judge, his grandfather a lawyer, and his family had built a legacy around the idea that justice must always be served, without exception. But somewhere along the way, Collins had developed a certain view of the world, one shaped by his experiences, his upbringing, and his environment. He believed that people made their own choices, and that the consequences of those choices were inevitable. In his eyes, young black men like Jamal Richardson often found themselves on the wrong side of the law because of the decisions they made. Collins didn't see this as prejudice. He saw it as a fact of life. Over the years, this mindset had become so ingrained in him that he rarely questioned it. He believed he was fair, impartial, and just, qualities every judge should embody. But what he didn't realize was that his decisions were colored by subconscious biases that had crept into his judgment. His courtroom became a place where young black men were often seen as guilty before proven innocent, where his assumptions about their behavior clouded the facts of their cases. Jamal Richardson was just another case in a long line of defendants who, in Collins's mind, fit a particular profile. He was quiet, avoided eye contact, and seemed nervous, a typical reaction from someone who knew they were guilty. Jamal's appearance and demeanor only reinforced the judge's assumptions. A black teen accused of stealing expensive electronics from a store. Collins didn't need much more than that to form his judgment. The lack of solid evidence didn't matter. He had seen enough to know how these cases usually ended. The prosecutor had laid out a shaky case at best, and Jamal's public defender had done little to challenge it. The store owner's testimony was riddled with inconsistencies, but Collins dismissed them, convinced that the boy standing before him had likely been involved in the theft. It was how he rationalized the decision. He told himself that he was upholding the law, doing what was necessary to keep the community safe. He couldn't afford to be lenient with kids like Jamal, kids who, in his mind, would likely end up in his courtroom again if he didn't take a firm stand now. As the months passed after Jamal's conviction, Collins carried on with his work as usual. He presided over other cases, gave out sentences, and continued to pride himself on being tough but fair. But every so often, Jamal's case would creep into his thoughts. That day in the courtroom, the way Jamal had stood there, stunned into silence when he was declared guilty, the way his mother had quietly sobbed in the back. Collins found himself thinking about it more often than he liked. There had been something about that case that didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. It wasn't until the new piece of evidence landed on his desk, unopened security footage from the store where the theft had allegedly taken place, that the full weight of his actions began to dawn on him. The file had been marked urgent, and the oversight of not reviewing it earlier gnawed at him. It wasn't typical for Collins to second-guess his decisions, but this time he felt compelled to watch the footage. What if he had been wrong? With a heavy heart, he played the video, his eyes fixed on the screen as the footage unfolded. The camera footage showed Jamal entering the store, wandering through the aisles, but doing nothing out of the ordinary. He picked up a few items, looked at them, and put them back. Then, as he was heading for the door, the store alarm went off. Jamal had immediately stopped, confused, as the store owner pointed at him accusingly. The police had arrived shortly afterward, and Jamal had been arrested on the spot. Collins sat back in his chair, stunned. The footage clearly showed that Jamal had not stolen anything. He had been wrongfully accused, and worse, Collins had not taken the time to consider the inconsistencies in the case. He had jumped to conclusions based on assumptions that had more to do with Jamal's appearance than with the facts presented. The realization hit Collins like a blow to the gut. He had condemned an innocent boy to a juvenile detention center, all because he had been too blinded by his own biases to see the truth. He had always prided himself on being impartial, but now he saw how deeply flawed his judgment had been. Collins had made a mistake that had cost Jamal his freedom, his dignity, and perhaps his faith in the justice system. The guilt that followed was overwhelming. Collins began to question everything. How many other cases had he mishandled? How many other young men had been sentenced unfairly because of the assumptions he had made? The thought tormented him, keeping him awake at night, his mind replaying the scenes of Jamal's sentencing over and over. For the first time in his career, Judge Collins doubted himself. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The next morning, he requested a meeting with the public defender and the prosecutor from Jamal's case. He knew he had to make things right, no matter the cost to his reputation. Collins had spent years building an image of a tough, no-nonsense judge, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was correcting his mistake, even if it meant admitting his failure publicly. The legal process to reverse Jamal's conviction began immediately. Collins personally ensured that everything moved swiftly, knowing that every day Jamal spent in detention was another injustice. He contacted Jamal's mother, apologizing for the harm he had caused, though his words felt hollow in the face of the pain he had inflicted. When Jamal was finally released, Collins arranged to meet him in person. Standing before the young man he had wronged, Collins felt the weight of his mistake in a way he had never experienced before. He had always seen himself as someone who delivered justice. But in this moment, he realized he had failed in the most fundamental way. "I'm sorry," Collins said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. Jamal stood silently, his expression unreadable. The boy who had once been terrified in the courtroom now stood taller, stronger. Collins wondered if he would ever be able to forgive him, but he knew that wasn't the point. This wasn't about seeking forgiveness for himself. It was about acknowledging the harm he had caused and doing whatever he could to make things right. From that day forward, Judge Nathaniel Collins approached his role on the bench with a new perspective. He took the time to listen, to question, and to reflect on the biases that had clouded his judgment for so long. He attended workshops on racial bias, spoke openly about his mistakes, and worked with community leaders to ensure that others in positions of authority were aware of the dangers of unconscious prejudice. Collins had always believed that justice was about following the law, but now he understood that true justice required more. It required empathy, self-awareness, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. He knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he could use his position to ensure that it never happened again. Not in his courtroom, and not on his watch. Through his journey of self-reflection and growth, Judge Collins transformed into a man who no longer saw the world in black and white. He learned that people were more than the labels society placed on them, and that his role as a judge was not just to deliver sentences, but to seek truth and fairness for all. Jamal Richardson was only 17, but he had already learned that the world often saw him in a way he didn't recognize. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, he had always been taught by his mother, Sandra, to be respectful, work hard, and stay out of trouble. She raised him on her own, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. Life hadn't been easy, but Sandra had instilled in Jamal the belief that despite the challenges, honesty and integrity would always pay off. When Jamal was arrested for a crime he didn't commit, the shock reverberated through his family and community. It wasn't just the humiliation of being falsely accused of stealing electronics from a local store. It was the sheer disbelief that someone like him, a quiet kid with no prior offenses, could be treated like a common criminal. He had walked into that store to browse, like he had many times before, but this time was different. This time, the store owner had watched him more closely, suspicious of his every move. When the alarm went off by mistake, all eyes turned to Jamal, and suddenly, he found himself in handcuffs despite his protests of innocence. Jamal's mother, Sandra, was devastated. She knew her son wasn't a thief, and seeing him led away by the police like a hardened criminal tore her apart. Sandra had always been strong for her family, never asking for help, never showing weakness. But in the days following Jamal's arrest and quick conviction, she found herself feeling helpless. The legal system seemed like a giant she couldn't fight, and Judge Collins, who had swiftly sentenced Jamal, seemed cold and unreachable. She knew this wasn't just about Jamal. It was about how the world saw her son, how society had already made up its mind about him before he'd even had the chance to defend himself. Jamal wasn't judged for who he was, but for what others assumed him to be because of his skin color. It wasn't the first time Sandra had seen this kind of prejudice. She had experienced it herself in her own life, being treated with suspicion or outright disrespect because of her race. But she had always hoped that Jamal, in his generation, would face less of that. She had hoped things would be different for him. In the weeks following Jamal's sentencing, the community rallied behind the Richardsons. Neighbors who had watched Jamal grow up, who knew his character, came together to support Sandra. They organized protests, wrote letters, and reached out to local activists, demanding that Jamal's case be reopened and reviewed. Word spread quickly that Jamal had been wrongfully convicted, and soon, local media outlets picked up the story. The attention was more than Sandra could have ever imagined. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, but for her son, she would do whatever it took. Jamal's case became a symbol of the broader issue of racial injustice in the community. People were tired of seeing young black men like Jamal treated unfairly by the legal system, tired of the assumptions and biases that led to so many innocent lives being upended. They weren't just fighting for Jamal's freedom, they were fighting against a system that had failed them time and time again. Through it all, Sandra remained a pillar of strength, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. She attended every protest, spoke at community meetings, and refused to let Jamal's spirit break. Jamal, who had been so shaken by the arrest and trial, drew strength from his mother and the people around him. He knew that if his community believed in him, then he had to believe in himself. But even with the support, the weight of the experience was crushing. Every night in the juvenile detention center, Jamal lay awake thinking about the judge who had so easily sentenced him, wondering how a man who had never spoken a word to him outside of that courtroom could decide his fate so quickly. What had Judge Collins seen when he looked at Jamal? A criminal? A statistic? Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he said or did, people like Judge Collins had already decided who he was the moment he walked into the courtroom. And that hurt more than anything else. But Sandra wasn't going to let her son be defined by one man's judgment. She had always told Jamal that he was more than what the world saw. And now, she was determined to show the world that. She contacted a lawyer with experience in wrongful conviction cases and started working tirelessly to appeal Jamal's sentence. The lawyer, a black man who had fought similar battles for other wrongfully convicted young men, saw Jamal's case as a clear example of racial bias in the justice system. Together, they filed for an appeal, pushing for new evidence to be considered, specifically the security footage that had been overlooked during the initial trial. Meanwhile, the community's support continued to grow. Local churches held prayer vigils, students from Jamal's school organized marches, and even some of the town's business owners joined in, calling for the judge to reconsider his ruling. The pressure mounted, and Judge Collins couldn't escape it. Everywhere he turned, it seemed like people were talking about the Jamal Richardson case. What had seemed like a routine conviction to him had become a local movement for justice. One evening, as Sandra prepared dinner in her small kitchen, she received a phone call from the lawyer. The appeal had been approved, and the new evidence was being reviewed. Her heart swelled with hope, but she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Still, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight lift ever so slightly from her shoulders. When the day of the appeal hearing arrived, Sandra stood outside the courthouse with Jamal by her side. He was quieter than usual, but there was a new determination in his eyes. He wasn't the same scared boy who had been wrongfully sentenced. He had grown stronger through the ordeal, but the pain of the experience still lingered. The crowd that had gathered outside chanted his name, holding signs that called for justice, for fairness, for an end to the biases that had led to his conviction. Inside the courtroom, Judge Collins sat at the bench once again, but this time, he was not the same judge who had sentenced Jamal. The weight of his decision, the growing protests, and the new evidence had forced him to confront his own role in the injustice. He watched Jamal enter the courtroom, standing tall beside his mother, and for the first time, Collins saw Jamal not as a defendant, but as a young man whose life had been shaped by forces beyond his control. Forces that Collins himself had contributed to. Sandra held Jamal's hand as they waited for the proceedings to begin. She knew that whatever happened next, they had already won in a way. They had shown strength, resilience, and unity in the face of injustice. They had refused to be silenced, refused to let prejudice define them. And in doing so, they had begun to change not just their community, but also the very man who had once seen Jamal as nothing more than a statistic. At the heart of Judge Collins' story is the powerful theme of racism and unconscious bias, both of which operate in subtle and often unrecognized ways. When Judge Collins sentenced Jamal Richardson, his decision was not driven by overt hatred or malice, but by a deep-seated prejudice that he himself was unaware of. Collins prided himself on being fair and just, yet his judgments were clouded by ingrained stereotypes about young black men. To him, Jamal fit the mold of someone likely to be guilty. A young black teenager accused of theft. The evidence was thin, but Collins, like many, had been conditioned to view young men like Jamal through a lens of suspicion. This unconscious bias is a central theme in the story, illustrating how prejudice can operate even in those who believe they are acting fairly. Collins didn't consciously decide to treat Jamal differently because of his race, but his years of exposure to societal stereotypes had led him to make snap judgments based on appearances. This bias had devastating consequences. His decision to sentence Jamal wasn't just an error in judgment. It was a failure to see the humanity in the young man before him. It robbed Jamal of his freedom, his dignity, and his trust in the justice system. As Collins begins his journey of self-awareness, he realizes that racism isn't always loud and visible. Often it lurks beneath the surface, influencing actions and decisions without being questioned. This realization is a painful one for Collins, as he must confront the fact that his own hands are not clean and that he has contributed to the very injustices he once believed he was preventing. The theme of empathy emerges strongly as Collins starts to understand the true impact of his actions. The protests, the letters, and the community's response force him to see Jamal not as a case number or a profile, but as a real person with a life, a family, and a future. The story underscores the importance of seeing beyond assumptions and looking deeper at the people behind the accusations. Collins learns that only through empathy and understanding can true justice be achieved. The theme of change is central to the story's resolution. Collins's transformation isn't quick or easy, but it is meaningful. He seeks to make amends, not just for Jamal, but for the other cases where his unconscious bias may have caused harm. He works to rebuild the trust he has lost with the community, showing that change is possible even for those in positions of power. Ultimately, the story highlights the value of forgiveness and community. While Collins can never fully undo the damage he caused, the community's willingness to hold him accountable and their eventual openness to forgive demonstrates that healing is possible when people confront their biases and work together to make things right. Collins' journey from ignorance to self-awareness serves as a reminder that even small, seemingly insignificant actions rooted in prejudice can have devastating effects. But with reflection and effort, people can learn, grow, and contribute to a more just society. The conflict in Judge Collins' story is set in motion when he makes a biased decision in Jamal Richardson's case. Without fully considering the evidence, Collins sentences the young black teenager to juvenile detention, driven by unconscious prejudice. Jamal's quiet demeanor and the mere accusation of theft are enough for the judge to believe that he is guilty, despite the lack of concrete evidence. In this moment, Collins fails to see Jamal as an individual and instead relies on the stereotypes that have shaped his view of young black men. This wrongful conviction becomes the central conflict, as it not only devastates Jamal's life, but also sets off a wave of outrage in the community. As Jamal is taken away in handcuffs, the impact of Collins's actions ripples through the courtroom and beyond. Jamal's family, heartbroken and angry, vows to fight for justice, and the local community quickly rallies behind them. Protests begin to form, calling attention to the injustice Jamal has suffered. The media picks up the story, shining a spotlight on Judge Collins' decision and the racial biases inherent in the legal system. Collins, who has always seen himself as a fair and just judge, is forced to confront the fact that his decision was not only wrong, but deeply harmful. The climax comes when new evidence emerges, a security camera footage that clearly shows Jamal was not involved in the theft. The footage, which had been overlooked in the initial trial, exonerates Jamal completely. When Collins watches the video, his heart sinks. For the first time, he sees the boy he condemned as an innocent victim, someone whose life he has profoundly affected. The footage forces Collins to confront the uncomfortable truth. His decision was not based on facts, but on assumptions, and those assumptions were rooted in racial prejudice. This moment of realization is deeply painful for Collins. He understands that his actions have not only wronged Jamal, but also reinforced the very stereotypes he believed he was above. His sense of self as a fair and impartial judge crumbles as he realizes that his judgment was flawed, and that flaw has caused irreparable harm. It is a moment of reckoning for Collins, who is now faced with the full weight of his biases and the consequences of his actions. The resolution begins as Collins takes responsibility for his mistake. He reaches out to Jamal's family, offering a personal apology for the harm he caused. Though his apology cannot erase the trauma Jamal and his family have endured, it is a step toward making amends. Collins also makes a public statement acknowledging his error and the role his unconscious bias played in Jamal's wrongful conviction. Collins doesn't stop there. He volunteers to work with community organizations focused on addressing racial bias in the justice system, hoping to use his position to bring about meaningful change. He attends workshops on racial sensitivity and unconscious bias, determined to educate himself and ensure that such a mistake never happens again in his courtroom. The story ends on a note of hope and redemption. While Collins cannot undo the past, his willingness to confront his own biases and work toward change shows that growth is possible. Through his actions, he begins to rebuild trust with the community and serves as an example of how people can evolve when they are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and actively work to correct them. The story leaves the audience with the message that while racism is deeply harmful, people have the capacity to learn, grow, and create a more just world when they confront their own prejudices and take responsibility for their actions. Judge Nathaniel Collins tapped his pen against the polished wood of his desk as he glanced through the case file in front of him. The name on the document was Jamal Richardson, a 17-year-old black teenager accused of theft. Collins flipped through the pages with mechanical precision. The case seemed routine, a petty crime, nothing unusual. The store owner claimed Jamal had stolen electronics from his shop, and the boy had been arrested shortly after. There was no concrete evidence, but to Collins, that wasn't necessarily a problem. He had dealt with enough cases like this to trust his gut, but this time, something felt different, though Collins couldn't place it just yet. He shook the thought away. He had a job to do, and that job was delivering justice quickly and efficiently. The courtroom was hushed as Jamal stood nervously at the defendant's table, his eyes downcast, hands fidgeting. Collins barely glanced at him before turning to the prosecutor, who began presenting the case with rehearsed confidence. The store owner's testimony was weak and riddled with inconsistencies, but the prosecutor pushed forward, emphasizing that Jamal had been seen near the electronics section shortly before the theft occurred. No video footage was available, and no fingerprints had been found, but the prosecutor's words painted a clear enough picture for Collins. A young black teenager in a store, in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Jamal's public defender rose to speak, Collins found himself tuning out, already convinced of the boy's guilt. The lawyer's arguments were flimsy, attempting to point out the lack of evidence and the inconsistencies in the witness's testimony, but Collins had already made up his mind. He had seen it all before, kids like Jamal making poor decisions and ending up in front of him. It was predictable. The judge's decision came quickly, too quickly for Jamal's family seated in the back of the courtroom to fully process. Collins declared Jamal guilty and sentenced him to 6 months in a juvenile detention center. There was a gasp from the gallery, but the judge barely registered it. To him, it was just another case, another name in the system. He moved on to the next file without a second thought, but something lingered. That night, as Collins sat in his study going over the next day's cases, he found himself thinking about Jamal. He remembered the boy's face, the fear and confusion in his eyes as the sentence was handed down. Collins had seen similar looks before, but this time it stayed with him. He pushed the thought away again, convincing himself that he had done what needed to be done. Justice had been served, hadn't it? A few days later, Collins began hearing whispers about the case. The local community had rallied behind Jamal's family, insisting that he was innocent. There were protests outside the courthouse, people holding signs demanding that his case be reopened. Collins felt the first twinge of doubt creeping in, but he dismissed it. The law was the law. He had followed procedure. Still, the protests grew louder, and Collins couldn't ignore them forever. One evening, as he was leaving the courthouse, he spotted Jamal's mother, Sandra, standing at the front of the protest. Her face was a mixture of anger and grief, and as Collins walked by, their eyes met for a brief moment. Sandra didn't say a word, but the pain in her eyes spoke volumes. Collins quickly averted his gaze and hurried to his car. He tried to shake off the encounter, but it stayed with him, gnawing at the back of his mind. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Jamal's case had become a local controversy, with news outlets picking up the story. They highlighted the lack of evidence and the quickness with which Collins had delivered his verdict. The judge's reputation as tough but fair began to waver, and for the first time in his career, Collins found himself under scrutiny. He began to question whether he had been too hasty in his judgment, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The turning point came when a new piece of evidence surfaced. Security camera footage from the store that had initially been overlooked. The footage showed Jamal walking through the aisles, looking at items but never taking anything. When the store alarm had gone off, Jamal had paused, confused, and then cooperated fully with the store's employees. The video clearly exonerated him, and the oversight was undeniable. Collins watched the footage in his chambers, his stomach twisting with guilt. He had been wrong. There was no doubt about it. He had sent an innocent boy to juvenile detention based on his own assumptions, on a gut feeling that had been shaped by years of unconscious bias. He had never truly considered the possibility that Jamal could be innocent. He hadn't even looked at the case with the level of scrutiny it deserved. The realization hit him hard, and for the first time in years, Collins felt truly ashamed. He had prided himself on being an impartial judge, someone who upheld the law with fairness. But now, he saw the cracks in his self-perception. His bias had blinded him, and Jamal had paid the price. The next day, Collins called a meeting with the prosecutor and Jamal's lawyer. He knew he had to rectify his mistake, no matter the cost to his reputation. He couldn't allow Jamal to suffer any longer because of his failure to see beyond his own biases. The case was reopened, and Jamal's conviction was overturned within days. The young man was released from detention, but the damage had already been done. Collins felt an overwhelming need to apologize, though he knew no words could undo the harm he had caused. He requested a private meeting with Jamal and his family, nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. When he finally stood before them, Collins struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice wavering. "I made a terrible mistake. I didn't see you for who you are, and I let my own assumptions cloud my judgment. I failed you, Jamal. I failed your family, and for that, I am deeply sorry." Jamal looked at him, his face expressionless, but Collins could see the pain behind his eyes. Sandra, standing beside her son, remained silent for a moment before speaking. "Sorry doesn't give my son back the time he lost," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's a start." Collins nodded, knowing that it would take more than an apology to make things right. He pledged to work with local community leaders, attend racial bias training, and take a more careful, empathetic approach in his courtroom from that point on. He also committed to supporting initiatives aimed at preventing wrongful convictions, recognizing that his position of power came with a responsibility to ensure justice was truly served. The road to redemption wouldn't be easy, and Collins knew that he would carry the weight of his mistake for the rest of his life. But for the first time, he felt the stirrings of real change within himself. He could never give Jamal back what he had taken from him, but he could work to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. His journey of self-awareness had only just begun, but Collins was determined to walk that path, no matter how difficult it might be. As he left the meeting, Collins looked back at Jamal and his mother, who stood strong and resilient despite everything they had endured. In that moment, he understood the true meaning of justice, seeing people not for the labels society placed on them, but for their humanity. Judge Nathaniel Collins sat alone in his chambers, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. In front of him, the screen replayed the security footage that had been discovered too late, the footage that clearly showed Jamal Richardson's innocence. Collins watched as the young man moved through the aisles of the electronics store, picking up items, inspecting them, and then putting them back. There was no theft, no suspicious behavior, nothing to suggest that Jamal had committed the crime for which Collins had sentenced him. His heart pounded in his chest, louder with each passing second. Collins had seen this footage before, but now, as the truth stared back at him from the screen, it was unbearable. He paused the video at the exact moment when Jamal looked up, confused as the store alarm blared, an innocent expression on his face. Collins couldn't deny it any longer. He had been wrong. Horribly, undeniably wrong. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave, washing over him in waves of guilt and shame. For years, Collins had prided himself on being a fair and just judge, someone who always did what was right. But now, the very foundation of his self-image had crumbled. He wasn't the impartial figure he had always believed himself to be. He was biased, and that bias had destroyed an innocent boy's life. His mind raced back to the courtroom, to the moment when he had declared Jamal guilty. He remembered how he hadn't given the boy's defense much thought, how he had dismissed the inconsistencies in the case, and how he had relied on his own assumptions about young black men in situations like this. He had trusted his gut, a gut that, as it turned out, had been poisoned by prejudice. How many times had he done this before? How many other boys had been victims of his unconscious bias, sentenced without the proper scrutiny simply because they fit a certain image in his mind? Collins felt his hands tremble as he clasped them together on his desk. The weight of his mistake was crushing, pressing down on him with the force of a truth he could no longer escape. He had failed Jamal, failed his family, and failed the very principles he had sworn to uphold as a judge. His breath grew shallow as the enormity of it all settled in. He wasn't just responsible for one wrongful conviction. He was responsible for perpetuating a system of injustice that had claimed too many lives like Jamal's. Suddenly, there was a knock at his door. Collins jolted from his thoughts, his heart pounding even harder. He wasn't ready to face anyone, not now. But before he could say anything, the door opened and his clerk stepped inside. "Judge Collins," the clerk began cautiously, "there's a crowd gathering outside. Jamal Richardson's family is here, along with many others. They've requested to speak with you." Collins' stomach churned. He had seen the protests on the news, the calls for justice that had grown louder every day since Jamal's conviction. He had done his best to avoid it all, telling himself that it was just the noise of a disgruntled community. But now there was no avoiding it. The truth had caught up with him. "I'll be right out," Collins replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The clerk nodded and left, leaving Collins alone once again with his guilt and regret. For a moment he considered not going. What could he possibly say to them? How could he face Jamal's family knowing that he had stolen months of their son's life? But he knew there was no choice. He had to face the consequences of his actions. If nothing else, he owed them that. Collins stood and straightened his suit, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He walked slowly toward the door, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the courthouse steps, the voices of the crowd grew louder, and he braced himself for what was to come. When he stepped outside, the air was thick with tension. A large group of people stood before the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Jamal and End Racial Injustice." At the front of the crowd stood Jamal's mother, Sandra, her face a mixture of grief and anger. Beside her was Jamal, his eyes downcast, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence as Collins stood at the top of the steps, the weight of every gaze upon him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain himself? How could he begin to make amends for the harm he had caused? Before he could say anything, Sandra stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Judge Collins," she began, "we're here because you made a decision that changed my son's life forever. You didn't see him for who he was. You saw what you wanted to see, a criminal, not a child. You took away his freedom, his future, based on assumptions. And now we stand here, demanding answers." Collins's throat tightened, and he swallowed hard. "Mrs. Richardson Jamal," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "You're right. I failed you. I failed your son. I made assumptions based on prejudice, and I didn't give him the fair trial he deserved. I've spent my life believing I was a fair and just man, but I see now that I was wrong. I can't take back what I did, but I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my life working to make things right." The crowd murmured, but Sandra's eyes remained fixed on Collins. "Promises won't give my son back the time he lost," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "But we need more than words. We need change." Collins nodded slowly, feeling the full weight of her words. "You're right, and I will work toward that change. I'll make sure that no other child is treated the way Jamal was treated. I'll fight for reforms in our courts, and I'll work to educate myself and others about the biases that have poisoned our system." As he spoke, Collins could feel the eyes of the crowd watching him, judging him. But he didn't flinch. This was his moment of reckoning, and he knew he had to face it head on. "I know I can't ask for your forgiveness," Collins continued, his gaze shifting to Jamal, who finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "But I hope that, in time, you'll see that I'm committed to making things right. I'm sorry for what I did to you, Jamal. Truly, deeply sorry." Jamal didn't respond right away, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps not forgiveness, but understanding. Collins could see that Jamal was still hurting, still processing the trauma he had endured. But in that moment, Collins felt a glimmer of hope. He couldn't undo the past, but he could build a future where justice was truly blind, and where every person who stood in his courtroom was seen for who they really were. As Collins turned to leave, the crowd began to disperse, but the weight of his actions would stay with him forever. He had been shaken to his core, but it was in that moment of reckoning that he truly began to change. Imagine if one day you were walking down the street minding your own business, just living your life. Maybe you're on your way to work or heading home after a long day, and suddenly someone accuses you of something you didn't do. You protest, you explain that they must have the wrong person, but no one listens. What would you do if, despite having no evidence against you, you were judged based on the way you looked or the assumptions someone had made about you? How would you feel knowing that your fate was decided not by the facts of your case, but by the color of your skin. This is what happened to Jamal Richardson, a 17-year-old boy who was just trying to navigate life like any other teenager. He had dreams, ambitions, and hopes for the future, but all of that came to a halt the day he was wrongfully accused of theft. He found himself standing in front of Judge Nathaniel Collins, a man whose years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts that were, in reality, clouded by unconscious bias. Judge Collins wasn't an overt racist. He didn't wear his prejudice on his sleeve or consciously seek to harm anyone. But like many people, he carried with him assumptions that had been ingrained over the years. Assumptions about who is more likely to commit crimes, who is more likely to be guilty, and who deserves a second chance. Without ever realizing it, those assumptions played a role in how he saw young black men like Jamal, and they shaped the decisions he made from his bench. When Jamal stood in that courtroom, Judge Collins didn't see an innocent boy who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw a stereotype. He saw what society had taught him to see, a troubled teenager who was up to no good. And because of that, he didn't question the shaky evidence or the inconsistencies in the case. He didn't give Jamal the benefit of the doubt. What if Jamal had looked different? Would Collins have paused, reconsidered, or demanded more proof before issuing his sentence? The tragedy here isn't just what happened to Jamal, though that alone is heartbreaking. It's the way unconscious racism like this ripples through communities, affecting not just individuals, but entire families, neighborhoods, and even future generations. Imagine if your child, your sibling, or your best friend was sentenced unfairly, not because of anything they had done, but because someone in power had allowed bias to guide their judgment. Imagine the anger, the pain, and the helplessness you would feel, knowing that justice was denied simply because of a system that is far from just. For months, Jamal sat in a juvenile detention center, his life put on hold. His mother, Sandra, fought tirelessly to prove his innocence, but the weight of the system felt too heavy to move. Every protest, every petition seemed to fall on deaf ears. What would you do if you were in her shoes? What if you knew your child was innocent but felt powerless to help? Sandra's strength in the face of such injustice was admirable, but it shouldn't have been necessary. No mother should have to fight to prove that her child is not a criminal when the evidence or lack thereof should speak for itself. And what about Judge Collins? How does someone like him, a man who believes in law and order, come to terms with the fact that he has been part of the problem? Collins never set out to harm Jamal. In fact, he believed he was protecting his community. But he had to learn a difficult and painful lesson, that good intentions aren't enough. That even those who believe they are acting fairly can cause immense harm when they don't question their biases. The turning point came when the security footage was discovered, footage that clearly showed Jamal hadn't stolen anything. The evidence that Judge Collins had failed to consider was now right in front of him, undeniable and damning. Collins had to face the reality that his snap judgment had destroyed an innocent boy's life. What would you do if you realized you had been wrong? If you had contributed to the suffering of another person, would you be able to admit it? Would you be willing to make amends, no matter the cost to your pride or reputation? For Judge Collins, this realization shattered him. It forced him to confront the fact that his actions had been driven by biases he had never taken the time to recognize. He was not immune to prejudice, and in his position of power, that prejudice had real and devastating consequences. He could no longer see himself as the fair and just man he had always believed himself to be. But there is hope in this story. Judge Collins didn't run from his mistake. He didn't hide behind excuses or claim ignorance. Instead, he took responsibility. He issued a formal apology to Jamal and his family. He worked with community leaders to push for reforms in the court system. He began attending workshops on racial bias and cultural sensitivity, learning what he had failed to understand before, that racism isn't always intentional, but its effects are always destructive. And what about Jamal? His release from detention was bittersweet. Yes, he was finally free, but he had lost months of his life to a system that had failed him. The experience left scars on him, on his family, and on his community. But through it all, Jamal remained resilient. He became a voice for others who had been wronged, speaking out about the need for justice reform and racial equality. His story became a rallying cry for those who demanded a better, fairer system. So, what can we learn from all of this? Imagine if we all took a moment to reflect on our own biases, the ones we may not even be aware of. What if we stopped assuming and started questioning? What if, instead of judging people based on their appearance or background, we took the time to see them for who they really are? Racism isn't always loud and obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, and hidden in the corners of our minds, influencing our decisions without us even realizing it. But we have the power to change that. We have the power to challenge our assumptions, to confront our biases, and to create a world where people like Jamal are treated with the fairness and dignity they deserve. So, I ask you, what will you do? Will you let unconscious bias guide your decisions, or will you take a stand against it? Will you be part of the solution, or will you allow the cycle of prejudice to continue? The choice is yours, and it's a choice that has the power to change lives.